I'd like to call to order the board work session for Monday, February 12th, 2024. If you could take the roll, please.
Mrs. Hartley?
Here.
Mrs. Henners?
Here.
Dr. LeFay?
Here.
Mr. Rager?
Here.
Mrs. Mast?
Here. If everyone would please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Our flag is over in the corner here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We need an approval for our work session special meeting agenda, please. So moved. Second.
Mrs. Henners?
Yes.
Mrs. Hartley?
Yes.
Dr. LeFay? Mr. Rager?
Yes.
Mrs. Mast?
Yes. All right. Moving on to item number 3. Dr. Chapman?
Yeah, so just real quick, at your stations there, board members, you see a coffee and a cookie, and that is from PTO. They wanted to extend the Board Appreciation Month here into a little bit into February. So that's who delivered those. And now on to the topic here. So last month at the regular meeting, we had presentation by AVG as far as the facility validation assessment. So remember again, in 2001, the OFCC, Ohio Facility Commission, uh, did their complete assessment of our district. Ultimately, they found that our facilities are in significant need of repair or replacement, and OFCC's recommendation at that time was they recommended a single campus pre-K through 12 facility, new construction. So AVG, that the board's architect firm, came and did their assessment really all of the summer and into the fall, and so they presented that last month and basically confirmed what OFCC found as far as the condition of our facilities. And AVG also presented not just one solution, but a few solutions, and even those are up for discussion. Those are not absolutes. So tonight, the purpose of tonight really is to hear the other side of that coin, or the other side of the story, which is facilities that we want, but then how do we fund it? And so we have Mike Burns here from Baird Financing, and he's going to run through a presentation, and it's really open for discussion from the board, and the board has allowed the public to clarifying questions and other questions, thought-provoking like that. So we're going to turn it over to Mike and go from there.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Burns. I'm with Baird. We're an investment banking firm. I'm located out of Columbus, Westerville area, and I work with school districts, a couple hundred school districts throughout the state of Ohio, as well as cities, townships, counties, many schools up in this area. Many of your neighbors I've worked with in the past. So very fortunate to be here tonight. Thank you all for allowing me to come to the work session tonight and share options. And as your superintendent just pointed out, it's still in this discussion phase. This whole project, including the financing. And I guess the point of these meetings is really to just learn what options are there. You can't just walk into your local bank and say, "Hey, I need a mortgage. I'm buying a home tomorrow." That's not how it works. There's a lot of legality and debt limitations and things we need to consider, before you can get to that point of doing the financing. So that's why I made the trip up. And again, thank you for allowing me to be here. I did make a trip up to answer questions. So by the board and anyone else that you're going to allow to speak tonight, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, so please ask. There's really no dumb questions. This is pretty complicated financing. It's something you don't do every day. You definitely don't do it if you're not in this industry. So please ask questions we go through. I'll try to make this quick. He said we have about 3 hours to talk, so that should be enough time. But here's the presentation. But all joking aside, I'm going to try to do this quickly and hit kind of on the high level. You know, we're not going to dig really deep into all these financing methods, what goes behind all this. I think it's a little premature to do that. But you have a good team assembled. You got your architect. They're working diligently to figure out the project costs, figure out the project scope. You've got myself to help you with the financing side and help you figure out what the best financing structure is. You also have your attorney, bond counsel, and they're also going to be heavily involved too once we get to that point. So that's your working team, and it's just moving the ball forward to a point where we can hopefully, if you choose to as a board, get some kind of ballot question on the ballot for the vote of the taxpayers. And by the way, it's great to see all of you here today too. It shows a lot of support by your community and interest and involvement from you guys. So thank you to all of you for being here today as well. I'm going to share on the screen. I know it's hard to see, but hopefully you can see it up there as well. Let's look at the first page here. Oh, that's not it. Right there. Yeah, it's pretty small print. I apologize. If you want to move up, please feel free to move up if you can see it a little better. Let's start with slide number 2 here. The most common form of financing for school districts who are pursuing a new school facility project is what you call a voted UTGO, unlimited tax general obligation bond issue. Voted UTGO, which stands for Unlimited Tax General Obligation Bond Issue. That's a property tax bond issue. And please don't quote me on this percentage, but if you had to twist my arm and ask me how many schools build a new school facility, how many of them use this type of financing, my estimate would probably be somewhere in 80 to 90% range to this type of financing for major new school facilities. Why? Because it's pretty straightforward. It's what you guys, the taxpayers, are used to, property tax for school districts. That's the main type of income revenue coming in for most school districts is property tax. The benefits of doing UTGO bonds is the lowest cost of financing. The second reason why this is the most popular is the lowest cost of financing in today's market for school districts issuing a significant bond issue. How it works essentially is we go to the voters, we have our story from our architect, we know what the project is, we know what the scope is, we know what the estimated costs are. You as a school, you get your capital campaign committee together. Your campaign committee takes the story to the taxpayers. The taxpayers vote yes or no on the bond issue if they want to approve it. The county auditor will collect the property tax from the taxpayers. The property tax is used solely to repay the bonds. So it's not going to pay for salaries, wages, anything else, just for the repayment of the bond issue. Maximum term is 40 years, 40 years. Most schools go the full term. So the maximum term is 40 years, but then you have to look at the useful life because you're not just building a building, you're also putting furniture, technology, equipment, all that FF&E that goes into a new building. That brings down the useful life to about 37 years. Again, I have this data back in my office. I didn't bring it. I apologize. But the majority of schools go out 37 years. And the reason why is they're trying to keep the millage, the ask of the taxpayers, as small as possible. We want to keep your costs as low as possible. So therefore, like your home mortgage, when you first bought your home, many of you remember that day, you probably didn't go out for a 15-year mortgage. You probably went for a 30-year mortgage. The reason why you go for a 30-year versus a 15 is to make your monthly payment smaller, right? That's probably why you did it back in the day. That's the same thing with going to 37 years on a voted bond issue. However, the term is up to you, the school board, to figure out, do you want to do the full term of 37 or do you want to do 30 years? And I'm going to share both those options with you. The weaknesses is you need voter approval. This is way too big a dollar amount. There's really no schools out there that can afford this size project out of your own pocket. So you need the support of the taxpayers, which is sometimes challenging. Your school district is very, very fortunate that you have a very supportive community. I have your election history going back 30 years, and your election history is stellar. You know, it's very, very strong. I know we had a little hiccup back in 21 when we tried to pass a new operating levy. I think it failed 2 times. But besides those 2 recent operating levies, you have pretty strong election history going back. So it's a good sign that your school, your community supports your school district. The other thing I want to talk about is the direct debt limitations. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Your superintendent mentioned OFCC. It's the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission. So very, very close. I explored that as well on my end because they have some nice programs which you can use to help fund your school project. But in your case, your community is considered wealthy. So in the eyes of OFCC. And because you're considered wealthy in the eyes of OFCC, your state share is very minimal. It's only 6%, as you can see on the slide here. And it's not going in the right direction either. Back in 2020, it was 7%. Now it's 6%. So you're kind of sliding, stable with the sliding in the wrong direction. If you ask the architects back behind me, they'll tell you very quickly, it's not worth using OFCC if your state match state share is not at least 18%. Because there's some additional costs involved with using OFCC, you lose control of the project because OFCC is involved and a number of other reasons. So the rule of thumb, if it's not 18% state share, it's not worth pursuing. You're at 6%. Going to the next slide here is debt limitations. And again, I apologize for the small print, but debt limitations. Schools are very limited on the amount of debt you can issue. Debt being the key word. I'm going to talk about a lease later. A lease is not considered debt. But in terms of debt, you're very limited on how much debt you can issue. Your direct debt capacity is $38.3 million. Okay? Don't file your CDX. I know the architects talked about larger project sizes than $38 million. You do have something called special needs direct debt capacity, and that's not a bad thing. Special needs direct debt capacity is not a bad thing. It's just how they label it. Your special needs direct debt capacity is $65,193,000. So keep that number in the back of your head. You're going to see that number pop up in a couple minutes. But that's the maximum amount of debt that you can issue, bonds that you can issue. And that's set by the Ohio Revised Code. And I know your treasurer and superintendent had a conversation with the county auditor recently. We're going to have to follow up with the county auditor at some point in the future, near future, to get updated assessed values because these direct debt capacities will change as your tax base changes. Okay. So I told you $65,193,000 is the maximum amount of debt you can issue. On page 4 of this presentation, you can see I ran some numbers assuming 50 million, 55 million, 60 million, and 65.19, the maximum amount. Ran those numbers for 30 and 37 years. The maximum term, 37 years, and 30 years because that's what a lot of us are used to, right? A 30-year home mortgage. So I ran them both ways, so you can kind of see ballpark what the cost or the ask is to the community. Let's focus on the most expensive item, most expensive one right now, just for discussion. But the story holds true for the other ones. The first set of millage rates in the green column there in the middle, that's if we sold the bonds today. Okay, that's the millage rate it would be today. The interest rate, the first interest rate is as of today. The first cost for a 100,000 home is as of today. But the problem is, you know, as I said before, we have to go to the voters. We got to get their approval. The earliest we can make it to the voters is November of 24. Okay, and that's something I think we're at least in discussion aiming towards. So if you decide to go in November of 24, we need to lock all of our financing terms down. We need to know the dollar amount from the architect. The board has to agree to, here's the project scope, and here's the estimated cost that I'm comfortable with as a board. Then we need to go ahead, I need to run a bunch of numbers. Then we got to pass resolutions. And then we got to get to the county auditor and file everything, all by like July, early July, July 7th, I believe. So we're going to lock everything in this summer, but we're not going to sell the bonds until the bonds are approved in November. And then we work through the process. We won't be selling the bonds until about this time next year. So for that reason, I add buffer into your interest rate, and that's why the second set of numbers is 0.5% higher, and the appropriate millage and cost per homeowner for each one. Does that make sense? So if I was you, I'd be looking at the second set of numbers, just to be conservative. Just kind of have your mind on the second set for now. So for 65,190,000, for those of you who can't see it, over 30 years, using the second more conservative millage rate, you're looking at about 8.73 mils, equates to about $305 per $100,000 home annually. That's over 30 years for the maximum amount of debt issue you can issue, 65,190,000. If you go 37 years, the last row on the sheet, 37 years, 65,190,000, more conservative millage rate, 7.87 mils, or $275 per $100,000 home. These are all preliminary, just for discussion purposes. You know, I can't predict the future. We're a year away from the future. But I think it gives you an indication of kind of where you fall in terms of what the ask may be of the community if you are able to do the project for $65,190,000. I'll pause there for a second. Is there any questions before I move off the bonds? This is going to, I got one more slide about bonds, but any questions? Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
Mike, thank you. In this last chart, the estimated annual cost per $100,000 home, where the $100,000 based on what valuation? Is this a county appraised? Is this the county like full market value? Like what is that benchmark?
That is the full market value, 100,000, because that's what they look at. So
By the county's
yes.
assessment?
So it sounds like you've been through this before with levies and kind of know some of the lingo, which is great. So what she's referring to is if you look your home up on the county auditor website, there's going to be two values. One's the assessed value. Each auditor labels it slightly different, but essentially one's the taxable value, okay, and one's the full market value. If you look at the two values side by side, the full market value should be similar to the value that you think your home is worth. And when I say think, I say that specifically because usually on the auditor website, the full market value is usually a little less than what you really can truly sell your home for, because that's what the auditor looks at as what your value is. The other one's the taxable value, and the taxable value is what you're being taxed upon, which is about 35% of your tax value, of your full market value. So to answer your question directly, Ms. Hartley, this is 100,000 full market value, okay? And she brings up a very good point. Once we figure out the structure, we'll share steps, step by step, on how to go to the county auditor website, look up your specific home, see what the value is, and a lot of times, on the county auditor website, you can put on a tax calculator on there that will calculate the true additional tax costs to each individual home. Very good question. Any other questions by anyone I can answer before I move on? Okay. Please keep thinking of questions. That's why I'm here. Please chime in. So the other variations you see are exactly the same, just smaller dollar amounts. If you look at page 5, this is my affordability graph. And I really like this graph for you guys. I think it tells a really good story. So even if you don't do a bond issue, say you decide not even to do this facility project, you just decide to keep these buildings as is. This is a really good graph for you board members. I assume you get a lot of people coming in saying, we're way overtaxed. I pay more taxes than my neighbors, things like that. You know, and that's very, very common. That's a very common thought process. You always look at your neighbors and you always want to do better than them. What this is telling me is it's looking at your median home value of $213,000. That's the median home value for this school district, and the earned taxable income average of $91,000. That's per U.S. Census. You know, that's not something I made up. That's straight off the U.S. Census for your school district. And it looks at those two variations, and that picks up the Jane Smith and the Joe Smith, takes their income and their home and moves it to each one of these school districts. For that income and that value of home, that's the total property tax that you're going to pay. So that includes library property tax, joint fire district, city, county, school district property tax, all property taxes, and only school district income tax if there is one. And you see, as of today, you're the second most affordable school district in this area. Vermillion, who's a client of mine, is the most affordable, but just barely. Actually, it's the same. Sorry, it's exactly the same. The line looked a little off, but it's exactly the same. So both of you are very, very similar. Edison is a client of mine, who's just slightly above you, at 35.15. Norwalk, and then I put Huron in, assuming the new bond issue passes. And that's assuming a 55 million bond issue, 37 years, 6.64. So I included that into your affordability, and you see what it does to your affordability. It moves you kind of right in the middle of all these schools, which is still really good. So now you get a new facility, and you're still pretty affordable. And I can tell you, Edison, like I said, is a client of mine. They're going on for a new school facility. They tried once already, and it did fail. I think they're going to try to go back. Vermillion's in pretty good spot. Norwalk, I heard, is doing a new school facility, so that property tax is going to go up quite a bit. Amherst, I think, is down the road, considering a new school facility, so they're already more expensive, and they're probably going to have more in the future. Perkins, can't remember, they failed, didn't they, Mike? So they're going to come back eventually. They need new facilities really badly as well. So a lot of these schools in your area are going to see increased property taxes coming in because they need new school facilities just like you do. So I think this is a nice graph for you board members, and really a nice graph for the community to see that you're kind of in a good spot. The other thing I can add, just from my knowledge of working with a couple hundred schools throughout the state and living in Central Ohio, Central Ohio is the most heavily taxed area in the state. My taxes are significantly higher than this on a per dollar basis. My school district, I think, is Westerville, and I think we're in the top 10 of the highest property tax in the state. So this area, although it's a little more costly than more rural areas, it's still on the affordable side. So to be this affordable compared to your neighbors is a really good thing. So any questions on that? Okay. So I thought that was a positive slide as we talk about costs and costs going up. At least you're going up from a low point.
I'm sorry. Has Lorraine gone through recent capital projects? And we know Sandusky has. So if we look at those two for having a lot of new buildings, we're seeing where that number comes in. Okay.
So it's fair to say they also, their OFCC contribution significantly different than 6%.
A lot more, and I'm not sure what their size of bond issue. I can look it up very easily and send it to you if you like, but they still had a bond issue associated with it. So good point. Thank you for pointing that out. So we just talked about property tax bonds. That's the easiest way to go. If we're able to do a project at $65 million, we can just do a loaded property tax bond and be done. It's an easy story to tell the community. They're used to that story. It's the cheapest form of financing. If we find out the project costs are going to be greater than $65 million, which I think is at least, depending on what options we pursue, could be greater than $65 million. Then we got to figure out how we're going to fund the balance of the project, right? Because I told you $65 million is the max amount of debt you can issue. The way you finance the balance of the project is through what we call a certificate of participation. Or we'll be here say probably COPS. That's the acronym for it, COPS, Certificate of Participation. Essentially, a COPS is a lease. So a lease is not debt. A bond issue, a debt, is not a lease. So therefore, since a COPS is not a debt, it doesn't have to account towards your debt limitations. So that is the workaround. If the project gets greater than $65 million, our direct debt capacity, we can do a COPS issue for the balance. We don't need approval from OSCC. One drawback of COPS is that we can only go out 30 years. So we may go 30 years on the bond, or we could go 37 years on the bond, whatever you guys decide. A COPS, we're limited at 30 years, period. The other disadvantage of COPS is a little more expensive than doing a voted bond issue. And I'm happy to go into why, but for now, let's just leave it at that. It's a little more expensive. The biggest drawback of a COPS is with a bond issue, the repayment source is millage. bond millage, voted bond millage. That's your repayment source. With the COPS, you need to find a repayment source. Okay, you got to find a way to repay it. And I'm going to share some options. But for you, it's essentially a PI levy or income tax levy. Okay. The rest is I'm happy to go into more detail in the future. Again, for interest of time and trying to keep it at a high level for this point, I'm going to move on to the next slide. But again, if any board members or anyone else wants to hear more about a COPS, let me know. I'm happy to talk in more detail. This
And
slide.
Mike, sorry, Mike, I would say that in 2002, there was an addition put on Woodlands, and that was funded through one of these COPS programs. So Huron as a district is familiar with it. Probably, maybe not anyone at the table is familiar with it, but that was how we did that project, that addition. I believe we just paid it off, so I'm guessing it would be like a 20-year deal. Yep.
I can find that for you too if you need it. That's a very good point. Thanks for pointing it out. So it's something you're used to. And back then, when you did that, you looked for how am I going to repay this? And I forget how you actually did it. If you had a PI levy that repaid it. Is that how you
correct.
did?
We have continuing PI, and we used some of that annually for the last 20 years to make that payment. Yep.
So that's your dedicated repayment source. Going forward on this, you can see the top box, $65,190,000 for new PK12. These are numbers from the architect. New PK12, $65,190,000. The project costs for that new PK12 is about $77.3 million. Ballpark discussion, cost as of now. So the difference is $12,145,000. So we fund $12,145,000 of COPS. So how are we going to repay that $12,145,000? I got options. For renovation of Woodlands and new 612, they estimate about $78.4 million. Again, the bond amount doesn't change, so the COPS goes up to about 13.2. Or a new PK5 and a new 612, the largest, most expensive project is about $79.4 million. The bond amount doesn't change, so the COPS amount goes up to 14.2. Again, just round numbers at this stage. Nothing set in stone. The bond millage down below, that's the same as what you saw previously, the same numbers as the previous slide. I just wanted to put it in there again. So you did $65,190,000. It's going to cost about $275 per year per 100,000 fair market value of the home. How are we going to finance the balance? Go to the next page. There's two ways. One is you do have that continuing PI. So we can sit down with your superintendent and your treasurer, look at that continuing PI and say, out of that continuing PI, how much money do we have available on an annual basis? Can we carve off 200,000, 400,000, 800,000, whatever the dollar amount is? We can look and see, okay, how much of that PI levy can we carve off and dedicate for the repayment of this COPS? Now that the old COPS is paid off, can we push some of that old COPS payment to help cover the new COPS payment, right? I ran numbers assuming we don't use the continuing PI for now, okay? So I ran numbers you can see for 12.1, 13.2, and $14.2 million COPS. You're looking at additional 1.7, 1.85, and 2 mils. Again, we might be able to offset a portion of that or all of that with internal PI money at some point. That has to be discussed and determined. But you see, if you generate another PI for 1.7, 1.8, and 2.2 mils, you can see how much revenue it comes in the middle green box. You see the estimated COPS payment in the middle, and then a little bit of a rounding error in terms of surplus thereafter. If you did a 1.7 mil PI levy, a new 1.7 mil PI levy, you can add about another $60 per $100,000 fair market home value on an annual basis on top of the bond issue amount. Okay, so that just kind of gives you a round number, round idea of, is that an acceptable amount? Would the voters vote yes? And at the end of the day, that's what we care about. Well, we care about academics, number one, right? Two, we care about is it a safe learning environment that you can promote good academics in? And then three, would the taxpayers vote yes or no? So we need to look at this and say, realistically, do we think all three of those will happen with these costs? Make sense?
So in the beginning, you talked about a bond levy. And now you're talking about a COPS, which is a voted income tax levy, correct?
COPS is a lease. It's a way
Okay.
to get around a direct debt limit. The repayment source for the COPS could be a PI levy, existing PI levy, a new PI levy, or a new earned income tax.
Do you do those things together?
Yes.
Do you do a bond levy and a income tax levy at the same ask
Yes.
together?
You have to because you're financing one project. So if one fails and the other one passes, you're not doing the project. So you got to pass them at the same time. So I think where your mind's going, which is a very good thought process, is I think where your mind's going is that could be cumbersome and maybe expensive, right? So you got to tell that story. Like I said, voted bond issue is nice and easy because people understand it. And I don't make it sound like you guys don't understand other stuff, but it's a nice, easy, people are used to that story. When you add in other variables like income tax or additional PI levy, the story gets a little more cumbersome. So I'm sharing this with you because I like to be transparent and make sure you know everything going into your decision making. I have done it both ways, and I've been successful both ways. For example, Marion Local School District down in Auglaize County, they didn't work with me. They worked with one of my competitors. They did a pretty large property tax bond issue. It failed like 23%, pretty poor. I shared the income tax approach, and we did a combo property tax, income tax. We spent a lot of time educating the community and making them understand why we're doing it, how we're doing it, what it costs them. It passed at 65 or 66%. So it all comes down to communication and transparency. And I think that's one of the reasons why they asked me to be here tonight, is to share transparently with everyone, here's kind of what we're talking about. No decisions are made, but here's the things we're thinking about going forward. So it is a bigger story, but it's possible to get the story across.
Well, and I guess you're talking about that, and then, yeah, it is a bigger ask, it's a bigger story. It's, even though our community is, labeled a wealthy community, we also have a very aged community that relies heavily on Social Security, have been in their homes for, wondering, have you seen the effects of something like this on a community with our dynamics?
Throw me a softball. Because that's the point I was trying to make about Marion Local School District. They're a very farming community, and they're wealthy, but they're a very farming community. People, if you know what farmers are, I hate to say this on a recorded line, but farmers do a really good job of depreciating assets and making their income a little lower because their biggest property is their property. So if you put a big millage property tax on their farm, it's going to cost them a ton of money. But you put an earned income tax on, you get the farmer support. Same thing with the elderly. People on a strict revenue source income. That's a way that an earned income could help you, and it might be the right approach for you. And these numbers I put out here for the COPS is just a beginning point. I could run 1,000 numbers for you, and it just gets confusing. But after talking to you guys, if you say, hey, I think our earned income might help us pass a bond issue and pass this project, we could do a 0.5% income tax. And maybe we do 30 million on a COPS and 30 million on a property tax bond issue. There's all different ways we can run numbers. It comes down to, again, what do you think the ask would be most appropriate in terms of getting the voters to vote yes?
So we could adjust the ask. I think we could have a higher earned income tax ask and a lower bond levy ask
Yes.
to capture some of the monies we may not be getting in just a levy or a bond levy.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Now, the only drawbacks on income taxes, because again, I'm full transparency. Income tax is because you got to do a COPS issue. I said before, COPS is a little more expensive in terms of interest rates. It's a little more risk for the investors. And you can only go 30 years. So you don't get the benefit of stretching the payment out to make it smaller. The other reason why income tax is sometimes a little challenging is because you can only collect, school districts by law can only collect 0.25% income tax. So it's only 0.25%, 0.5%, 0.75%. So it's not as easy to manipulate the numbers, but yes, 100%. And I can run those very easily for you. And I would suggest, once we get to that point, we should have some good conversations, with your working team and your capital campaign committee, and sit down and talk through all these things and hear from the community. What does the community want? And then figure out what the best approach is for the school before we get to the ballot. And that's what we did at Marion. It worked. We changed it from 26% to 66%. So it's all about communication.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question okay?
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mike, I have maybe you could clarify too. I've been doing a lot of research on this, met with Mike and James, and gave a bunch of questions a couple weeks ago. But you're mentioning, and I did the math here and looked at your numbers, but on this table you have up, this is on an earned income tax, right? And maybe for the people in the audience and those listening, we can have you explain the difference between the earned and a regular income tax, because there is both options available. But the earned, I think, would be of particular interest to the community dynamics that Jody was just talking about.
100%. 100%. And I like earned income tax for schools because I think it's the most equitable way for what people can really afford. Just because, like your example, maybe you have someone that's retired, living in a home that's been in the generations forever. It might be a nice home, but maybe the mortgage paid off, and their income dropped a lot. So I think having earned income tax really helps because that individual only pays their share based on how much they can afford, which is a nice thing. To your point about the different types, traditional is not used as often anymore. Traditional income tax taxes everything. Okay, tips, wages, salaries, investment income, everything. Retirement, I believe, is in there as well. 75% sure retirement's in traditional. Earned income is only what you earn. Okay, so whatever shows up on your W-2, essentially. So those are the two different kinds. Most of the time, schools pass earned income tax. That's the new way to do it. Back in the day, it used to be traditional. Now it's earned. You can't have both, by the way. If you guys don't have income tax anyway, but you can't do both. On this next page, you can see the difference. And again, thanks for your softball there on that question. But this page is I got straight from the Ohio Department of Taxation. So again, this is not what I prepared. I like to do my research and source it out to other people. This is the Ohio Department of Taxation. I got it as of January this year, and it shows traditional base yield for 1/4%, as well as earned income tax. And for those of you who can't see it real good, traditional is let's round up to about $1,186,000 worth of revenue per year. If you do earned income tax, that's only about $763,000. So you can see the differences because of how one's on tax on everything versus one's only the earned income. So for the seniors, it's better for the earned income. And again, I don't want to ever say this, like, you take up votes, but that's a way to get the older community to vote yes, because I know everyone wants to support schools. Everyone does. I don't think there's anyone you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to at least support the school some way or somehow. But some people just can't afford it. So I think doing this approach could help if you guys agree. But again, that's your decision, not mine. My job is to advise you. Your job is to make the final decision. Did I answer your question okay?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Anything else on that you want me to go into? On the sheet, you can see it's broken out in eighths, but again, you can only do 1/4% by law. Okay, I don't want to be deceiving on this. Okay.
One of the challenges, like the balance, and certainly thinking of folks retired on a fixed income and taxing the property values. People with earned income tend to be more likely to, maybe if we look at who has kids in the schools who are in the buildings day in and day out, there are other variables. Our city has an income tax. The township, which is also in our school district, does not. So we already have, say half of the folks that would be affected by this are already paying an income tax to the city. Additionally, there are a lot of people who live here but do not work here, and they work in another city that also taxes them. So they're paying maybe 3% income tax already, say. They've got a city that's 2%, and they're paying 1% here. So I guess I just want to acknowledge that these are all the kinds of variables that we will certainly think about. That's going to affect my household.
Oh, sure.
My husband working in Cleveland and still pays taxes here and doesn't get a credit here. So just that this is very much on our radar too, is that it's not that there's one easy answer for this and trying to find something that's equitable, but I think affordable for folks, but recognizing that we have a really big task here in taking care of our buildings.
I couldn't say any better. And that's exactly the point I was hoping to get across is there's no right answer. Each community is different. It comes down to what you believe is the best option for your community. And the goal is to get the project done, right? And that's the goal, is to get the project done. So it comes down to where do you think you're going to get the yes votes? You know, what does your community want? Usually high income school districts usually have a harder time passing income tax for that exact reason. But if there's also a high elderly, population, that offsets some of that. So that's for you guys to figure out. It's my job to share those options. That's a very good point, though. Anything else on? I want to go back to this page real quick because we talked. We can change this however you wish, and I don't think I ever mentioned the bottom part, but that shows the income tax, and you see 1/4% essentially will fund all three of these, option A, B, and C, the 12, 13, and 14 million. You see on the right-hand side, I don't know, I can't see it, but see that red over there? Right there, the deficit. They are showing a deficit, and that's because I don't want to increase it to 0.5% because then you're going to see a big surplus. So that's the challenge when it comes to earned income tax, if you're limited to that 1/4%. If I increase that to 0.5%, it's going to be a huge surplus. Now you're kind of collecting too much, right? So that's for me to kind of size for you, but I just wanted to point that out. You might be saying, Mike, how are we going to pay for that deficit? Maybe that's part of the PI that you have. Maybe you can take $81,000 out of your PI to offset that shortfall. Or, maybe we change the dollar amount. There's a lot of different ways we can handle that, but I just wanted to point that out in case you had any questions.
Like on that point, so if you did like the 0.5%, you could lower your upfront bond though too, right? You could lower that and lower the years from 37 to 30 or something like that, because I mean, frankly, for me, the 37, I get it, you're spreading it out, but in 30 years, people who's sitting in these seats are going to be looking to renovate that building. So, I mean, just like with our houses and stuff, and we just got to balance all of that as we talk as a community. But it may be something worth looking at, the 0.5%, if that's how we go, or whatever, do a blended function and then reduce a little bit on the years or millage or something on the other side. That's a possibility.
Everything's a possibility.
Okay.
You tell me what you want to do, and we'll try to make it work from a number standpoint. I guess my thoughts on the 30 versus 37, when you're talking about a larger project and a larger ask, like we are here, I try to make that larger ask as small as possible, because you're on the side where it makes it harder to get people to vote yes. If we're talking a 2 to 4 mil levy total, then I see 30 years or maybe in 20 years. But when you have the size millage we have, just keep that in mind. It's on the larger side. So anything you do to make the millage, the ask smaller. And the way people look at that, he has a very good point. Everything he says is 100% true. But keep in mind, these buildings last a lot longer than 40 years. I'm not sure how old this building is, but I imagine it's at least 40 years, right? Yeah. So how old is it, you guys know? About 60, 70?
Is the class of
So but it has a lot of improvements. To your point, you gotta schedule those improvements out, because the roof, no matter how long the building lasts, the $1 million roof, which roofs do cost a couple million for a building this size, you gotta pay for that. It's probably 15 years, 20 years. HVACs go 15, 20 years. So a lot of big costs do come up. But yes, to answer your question, we can size this however you want, and I can run as many numbers as you want. Okay, so moving on. So we talked, and again, the last point I want to make on this is just for discussion, so we can change it. Moving on, if you decide to do a bond issue, if you decide to pursue this project, you got to do a bond issue. Case closed. And there's no way you can fund this internally. No schools can do a project even close to this internally. Wish we could. And honestly, I wish we could. It'd be a lot easier for everybody. So if we decide to move on, the next time we can be on a ballot is November 24, November 5th, 2024. I had mentioned before, and you see in the red boxes there, the bottom red box, would need special needs. So if we need special needs approval, which we do, in order to get above 36 million of debt capacity, we got to file everything, or the first step of filing stuff has to be July 8th. Okay? So work backwards. That means the month of June, we need to start make sure we pass all of our resolutions. We don't want to wait till the 8th. So we want to start passing them at regular board meetings and sometime in June. Then working back from that, you can't pass a resolution the same day you find out the project costs and what the scope of the project is, right? You want some time to think about it. So we want to make sure we kind of nail down the project costs, the scope, get the community involved, get their feedback in terms of kind of what are you looking for, probably between now and May. Is to start doing that. We don't need all the details of the project. You know, we don't need to know this classroom would be here, this classroom would be here. You know, we don't need all that. We just need a general, here's what we're doing, a PK6 or a PK5 or, you know, whatever, and that's what the community wants to support. After we get on the ballot in July, then that's when we're really focused with your architect. They do a good job, I'm sure, of working with you guys and saying, okay, what do you guys really want? We have $77 million or $65 million or $55 million. Here's what we can do. This is the size project that we can do. And that's when you work as a team to kind of figure out, okay, what exactly does the community want? How many classrooms? You know, what kind of amenities and stuff like that. That kind of comes after this July 8th date. So we got to live within the means of the budget, and the budget's what we need to have by, you know, May. Okay. And then the income tax will fall in soon after that, July 26th. You can see that a smaller circle in red. So July 8th, just have in the back of your mind, that's the absolute deadline to be on the ballot. Okay. If you can't make it to the July or November 24 election, then here's the deadlines in 25. November of 24 is going to be cheaper to be on the ballot because it's a big presidential election. You don't have to pay as much to be on the ballot because there's going to be so many different things on the ballot. So it's a cheaper option. If you can make it for the November, I think that's a good one to start with. And some of my clients, you know, honestly, some of my clients go out and maybe you decide you do a property tax first in November. If they vote it down, and then we kind of circle the wagons and maybe come back with the income tax in May, or vice versa. We kind of listen to the community and say, okay, you said no. What do you want to do? How should we change this to change your mind? Or we go out with the plan that we want, income tax and property tax. It's really up to you. But I think going to November is a cheaper option to go in November if you're ready. But again, I don't ever want to rush you. Please don't take anything I say tonight as rushing you. If you need to wait till May or even November next year, take your time, make the right decision on what you want to do. The only reasons why you consider going quickly is 1, November is cheaper. 2, project costs are only going to go up. I'm not an architect. These guys are architects. Talk to them. But I can tell you, people aren't taking pay cuts. You know, labor costs are not going down. Labor costs don't go down. Material costs aren't going to go down. They might fluctuate up and down a little bit, but they're not going to go down significantly. And then interest rates are pretty low still. But if you go in May, you can see what it does in May. We got to have everything ready by January 6th in order to be on the May ballot. So that's my last slide, I think. Went over a lot of information. Hopefully I didn't take too long here tonight. Try to keep it high level for you guys. But again, I'm here to answer questions. So if you want me to dig deeper, I'm happy to. Is there any questions by anyone?
To our audience that came this evening, please, if you have questions, we would love for you to take this time to ask any questions you may have.
Sure.
Yeah, so the estimate is all
Yes.
what dictates that? Like, because obviously that percentage is significantly between now and November. Like, is something really good?
Yes. So,
Excuse me, Mike, sorry, can you repeat the question for those
Yes.
that don't have the microphones?
yes, thank you. He's asking about on this slide, slide 4. You see, he's asking about the all-in. This slide, the all-in costs. All-in TIC is what we call it. All-in true interest costs. That's what that stands for. As I said before, I'm going to repeat myself and I apologize. The first interest rate is as of today. The second one is as of today plus 0.5%. That's the difference. The reason why I do that is because we got to set everything. I just got done saying the millage has to be, or the ballot question has to be set in July. We're not going to be, if the voters approve it in November of 24, we're not going to sell the bonds until about this time in 25. So February, March of 25 is when we're selling the bonds. So we have almost a year of interest rate risk. That's what you're alluding to, I think, is, you know, what happens between now and then. That's why we add a 0.5% buffer. I know the rates as of today are pretty close to where they are because I sell bonds often. I'm trying to predict what the future might hold. You can't do that. You know, if I could, I wouldn't be working. I'd be on the beach. But that's the risk we take, and that's part of my job is to try to mitigate that risk the best we can in order to hit the millage rates I share with you. Oh, so I'm going to sell the bonds. He asked who's buying the bonds since the interest rate changed. If the voters vote yes in November, and once we get through the whole process of issuing the bonds, my firm will sell the bonds to the universe of buyers. So that includes everyone sitting here. All of you can buy these bonds as your own personal investment, a portion of these bonds. I'll also sell it to pension funds, banks, insurance companies, the universe of buyers, people that buy tax-exempt bonds. Sell it to all those people. You know, we try to sell it at the lowest rate, or we will sell it at the lowest rate we possibly can. Once the bonds are sold, the interest rate's fixed for 37 years. Now, the only reason the interest rate will change is if we refinance it. Now, I've been doing this business long enough that I know no matter what interest rate we put on here, we're going to refinance that bond sometime in the future, just like you guys have done with your old bonds. And we refinance the bonds in the future, we're going to lower the interest rate because the term's going to go from 37 or 30 down to 20 or 15, 10, 5, all the way down. So shorter term, it's going to be a lower interest rate. We'll refinance it, generate savings. The savings go back to the taxpayers. The school never gets those savings. So the savings come back to you in the form of a millage reduction. So instead of paying 6.7 mils, that millage reduction will be reduced because of refinancing the bonds. The other thing to keep in mind is your millage rate is not set at these millage rates either. As your tax base grows, new homes pop up, new businesses pop up, inflationary increases. As your tax base grows, because you're a growing community, and I have history proof of that, your millage rate will always be reduced over time. It's an effective millage rate, so it'll always be reduced. So that's always a moving number too. Did I answer your questions okay? I think I got them all. Is that good? Any other questions? Very, very good questions. Yes, sir.
November 2024, voter turnout will be high.
You have a coin? Because you kind of flip a coin on that one. I'm joking when I say that, but it's a very good question. The reason I say I'm joking is because it really depends on the community. So I lived through the last couple elections where I've been doing this business as well, and have a lot of clients that had bond issues go during the last couple. And let's face it, the last couple elections have been a little controversial, right? So we've had a lot of angry people at the polls the last couple election histories. No matter which color you are, there's always people angry, because your person's not winning or whatever. People were really afraid of going on the ballot the last time. They thought the same thing just going through your mind right now is, are people going to be angry? Are they going to vote no? Too many people? It really depends on your community. One, depends what color your community is. Blue or red, Republican, Democrat. Two, depends on what type of people you have. Are they very supportive of your school district? Is it because of presidential election? Are you going to get a lot more of the soccer moms out? And I hate to be stereotypical, but are you going to get the soccer moms out, the football dads out? The people that come to all your football games and support the school because their kids go to school here and they want to see academics and athletics better. Are those voters more likely to come out during a presidential election versus a non-primary election? Or are you going to get out the naysayers? It could go either way. But historically, I can go back and I can pull history of the last couple of presidential elections, And I can tell you the last couple presidential elections really weren't off the mark in terms of the success rate passing them. Because I pay a lot of attention to this. They're really not off the mark. The bigger fear I have, if you want to know the bigger fear I have right now, this is for all my clients. I had, trying to remember numbers, but I think I had 10 ballot issues on the ballot back in May of this year. No, I'm sorry, I had 8. I had 8 on the ballot in May. There were only 18 bond issues on the ballot in May. Only 3 passed. And 2 of those were in the same school district. Brunswick City had a bond issue, and Brunswick City Schools. So really only 2 out of 17 bond issues passed in May. That's terrible. Usually they pass about 2/3 pass on a bond issue historically if you go back and look at the records. We only had 2 out of 17. That was terrible. The bigger fear I have is in today's world is it's a major anti-tax movement in the state of Ohio going across. It's hurting schools too. Talking about cutting funding and changing how funding works and things like that. Major anti-tax movement. It's not so much a presidential election in my mind, if you ask me directly. It's more of the sentiment in the world today. It's not just Ohio. If you look nationally, it's the same thing. So does that answer your question? So I don't really have a straight answer, but if you look historically, the presidential election doesn't scare me. It's more of the sentiment in the market. Now that was May of 23. No, good news is November, I think I had 11 or 10 on the ballot. And there were quite a few more. I think we had maybe 30 total in the state or somewhere around there. And I had 6 pass. So that's a lot better. That's more of the 2/3 number for me personally. So November got better. May was really ugly. And it had nothing to do with presidential election. Does that answer your question okay? On who those people are. Are they the people that support it, the soccer moms, the football dads? Or is it the naysayers who are just going to say no matter what? And each community is different. I don't know your demographics that well, but those people are. But I imagine some of you kind of have a general feeling of, who may or may not show up. Very good question. I wish I had the answer, but it's more subjective than factual. That makes sense? Any other two good questions? Anything else from the community? I know you have more questions than this because there's a lot of information, but please think about it. If you have questions, don't want to talk up today, that's perfectly fine. I understand. Reach out to your superintendent, your treasurer, send them an email. I'm sure they'll pass it along to me. I'm happy to respond, directly. If that's okay, Mike.
You said that the November election.
I'm not sure if you could hear, but she asked, why is the November election more affordable for school districts? The reason why is because the November election, they're already holding polling centers, right? Because you got the presidential election, they're already going to have that. They're already staffing and paying for it. So you share that cost with the federal government and every other levy and bond issue on the ballot. Where versus if you go in May, it's what you call kind of a special election, non-primary election, and you may be the only one on the ballot. So therefore, then the school district has to pay for all those polling stations and people to man it, and the booths and all that stuff. And don't ask me exactly how much it is, but it's how much is it, like 10, 15 grand, 20 grand?
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere in the high teens, low 20 range.
Yeah.
If you're the only one. But if you go in November, that's shared, so the costs are significantly less. So it's not like a game, a game changer, but we're trying to save every penny we can, right? So. Correct. That's how it's typically done. So you want to have a general idea of what the project is. I think they have they can talk a little bit about it, but I'm sure they have a general idea of the 3 or 4 options. He's asking, if everyone can hear, how much information we have to have by July when we set the millage rates. you want to have enough information to know what the project costs are and what type of financing you want to do. Income tax, property tax, just property tax. Then you hit and set up the ballot question. The fine details of exactly what goes in that building, you know, how many classrooms, where they're located, you know, that stuff comes between July and November, most of the time. I'm not saying that's not verbatim. Every school might, some schools might do everything before they get to July. Other schools might do everything after. But I think at the minimum, you need to have a project cost in mind, know what the building scope is, and then we can kind of focus between July and November of exactly what it's going to look like, you know, the size of the classrooms, move things around. You know, these guys are going to say it's 77 million or whatever the dollar amount is, but that could be 10 classrooms or it could be 12 classrooms. You know, they can fungible that a little bit, move it around. The other reason why I like that approach is that's also kind of fun, right? It kind of gets the community involved. You get them to show up and you talk about classrooms and what you can do, gym sizes, you know, whatever the case might be. Adds a little bit of fun, involvement, gets the movement going towards a successful bond issue at the ballot. Now, the only risk, and maybe what you're thinking of, is what happens if you have the community come in and they say, I don't want a K-5, or I don't want to do this. So that's, you know, you have to manage that relationship. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question okay? Very good questions. It's not like your home, you know, and the reason why we can't get the actual final cost of the project until after the bond's approved, and then you start working on getting the guaranteed maximum price contract with the vendor, the construction company, but you have to sell the bonds even before you get the guaranteed maximum price contract, and that's according to Ohio Revised Code law. So it's a little different from like your home. I know it sounds backwards. It's just how it works, but legally how it works.
I was actually thinking it was a lot like a house. Like if I was just gonna go out and look at a house, I'd find a lovely house that I like. It's beautiful. It was everything. And then I find out it's $5 million. I can't afford $5 million. No bank's gonna let me build a house or buy a house for $5 million. So I start with the funding, figure out what I can afford, and then I know my budget, and then go forward from there and have a better sense of what it and I still don't know exactly which house I'm going to choose, but I have a sense for it's going to be about this many square feet. It's going to serve these purposes. These things I want. I'm not going to have these things that would be lovely to have.
That's
But the $5 million house had.
That's a good way to look. It's almost like a pre-approval letter,
Right.
right? It's your pre-approval letter of that. So you're right on that. That's a good way to look at it. You know, good way to say
But I
it.
think it's hard to not know exactly. It's hard.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. That's a great comment. So you asked, you know, what happens if the construction costs come in longer? So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to go in November. Let's assume you go in November to make the timeline work. You go in November, be approved in November, February, March, we're going to issue the bonds. We're going to sell 62 million worth of bonds, 65 million worth of bonds. Then that's going to release these guys. They're going to start getting the drawings down, exactly what you want, you know, exactly the specs you want. Once that's going to take 6 months to a year, 6 months to a year, just developing the plan, the full plan of the project. So to your point, you don't really want to do all that now because, you know, it's costly. You're going to pay these guys a lot of money, and the voters may vote no. So that kind of comes after the fact. So you have a year of development of the plan. Then you bid it out, get a guaranteed maximum price contract, and then you start construction. It takes 3-4 years to construct, probably, right? Yeah, so you're looking at, Drew's point, 3 to 4 years all in. What do you do at that point? One is they work, and their cost estimate's a pretty nice contingency plan. You know, in terms of contingency amount for cost overruns. That's the first thing, and that varies by architect and based on what the board wants. Two, there's a little bit extra money that we don't always talk about. Like, so we're going to get 65 million. We're going to put 65 million into a savings account, you know, money market account. We're going to invest in CDs, U.S. Treasury, safe investments. That's going to earn some money. 65 million. Star Ohio is collecting 5.5%. 5.5% on 65 million for 3-4 years. That's going to add up. You're right. That's kind of also a contingency account to pay for any cost overruns on that project. So you got a 10 or 15% contingency plus your interest earnings. And then the last one is, you know, their favorite term, value engineering. You know, and they build a building and they value engineer it, right? And they go from, you know, whatever, you know, marble down to laminate floors. You know, I'm making that up, of course, to get the cost down to the point where they want. So it sounds backwards, and that's where my mind was when I said it's not like a school. Because I'm thinking like you are. You kind of get your money up front, and then you kind of figure it out from there, you know. And it sounds backwards, but that's how I guarantee you every school in the state does it. Like I said, I had in the past couple of years dozens of clients that went through exactly what you're doing. It works its way out. The only challenge we have is what we lived through the last couple of years. And God forbid that doesn't happen again for a while. But inflation rates went way high, right? Construction costs went way high. I think that's, I don't want to say once in a lifetime thing, but I don't think that's going to be every 3-4 year thing either. You know, so I hope that doesn't happen between now and when you guys get your guaranteed maximum price contract in. Assuming that doesn't happen, this will play out just fine. But if we do have another big 30% increase, 40% increase in costs like we did with inflation, what we do, I've done several of these, we have to do cost overrun financings. And there's workarounds for that as well, where we do a COPS, where the school funds it internally, or we change the project. There's ways to work around that, I promise you. It's not good ways, but there's ways to work around that. And I've lived through that with many of my clients, just because of bad timing. Does that make sense? And that's the hard part for me too. I struggled with that when I first started doing this for a living. I thought, wow, that sounds a little backwards, but that's just the way Ohio law works. It has nothing to do with me, the school. It's law. Okay. So if I could.
More efficient. I think in general, the question, right, was going through my mind too of like, this is good, being aware of what, when we look at the environmental factors, it's our environment, but it's also the community environment. So we talk about the income tax that's here. This year I'm planning on increasing its income tax to people. What kinds of levies also might be out there? Are there other entities that we could be looking at additional taxes? Are there bonds that they need to put out there? I think that for us internally, that is a question that we consider too, is what does an operating, when would an operating, what would it be needed for? So all of that, like this is the fact finding, this is the information gathering, but you're absolutely right. Like it all needs to be considered. I mean, this is the cost of doing business as a public school district.
And if I can add real quick, is building the building, you're going to eliminate these old buildings, inefficient buildings. and hopefully, I don't know if you're gonna end up selling the property or whatever you end up doing, but building the building is not gonna be additional costs. You know, in fact, the new building might even be cheaper to operate, on utilities and stuff. So building the building doesn't do anything, but there's additional costs. Yep. Yep. That's what I was alluding to, is that's building the building. So building doesn't affect it, but you're talking about is operating levy down the road for everything else besides the building, which is two different things. You know, you're going to still have the cost of the buildings now if you don't do the new facility. You're just replacing that. But you're exactly right. The operating side of it is, you know, everyone here wants a pay raise, right? At some point, you know, that's the way of life. Inflation's going to go up. No one's going to take a pay cut when inflation goes off. You're exactly right. And that's part of the conversation that we'll have with the treasurer and superintendent and the board, and, you know, try to manage that the best, push that buck down the road as far as we can. Is that fair response?
I appreciate your question, Kurt. I mean, that's a very valid question. You know, think about those things down the road.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think our hope is when we create like a simpler set of buildings and operations. So right now, you know, when you think of when we sat down here 2 years ago at this table for the first time, we were running four buildings that the OFCC said all had major problems, right? We've already simplified that down from 4 to 3, not to make money, but to simplify, frankly, risk and like operations, right? So instead of having 4 old buildings that constantly need attention, now we're down to 3, right? And the goal is at most, I think, if we're reading the recommendations, is to get down to at most 2, maybe 1, and that's what I think we're going to have to start exploring. But we know that there's going to be significant efficiencies that we gain when instead of and things get easier when we have to transport to 2 campuses instead of 4 across town, right? And
You
so
can take your high schoolers to the same place you're taking your 7th graders, and the 7th graders have busing already.
So, you know, we see, I mean, I think we want to keep our minds open, right, for this whole process and not say this is what's happening. And because we want the community to tell us, and we think the answer will come once we work together to get it. But I think whatever the answer is, we see this a better situation where we started 2 years ago, which is 4 really old buildings scattered all across town, which was never going to be easy or efficient to serve.
Just to step back for 1 second on Kurt's point, I pulled up the report from AVG, and in just the high school, for example, they had a 10% design contingency, a 10% construction contingency, and a 10% material escalation, which equaled about what is that? About $7 million, and then another 16.3% in non-construction costs. So there's 10% in each of those categories for the cost overruns in the proposals or the rough numbers we have.
For us, the credibility sweet spot is finding where do you build those contingencies in so that you're not, you know, in a tough spot if something changes, but then you're not asking for anything more than what you credibly need, right? So like, where is that sweet spot? So that when we go to the taxpayers, we can make a credible case as to at least what something costs without it seeming like it's been inflated. Right?
So I'm coming from higher ed, public higher ed, where I did fundraising. So no buildings, nothing is done at universities without some component of donors giving money to help make things happen. Is that something that we see happening within public K-12 districts, where there is a component that perhaps people who want to give money to help support the projects?
It's interesting. I just had a conversation this morning about this specifically. Yes, to answer your question, yes, is the answer. However, we need to be careful on it. We're going to be issuing what you call tax exempt bonds. And with tax exempt bonds, there's what we call bad money. And bad money is donations with naming rights. People can give donations. You can buy bricks. I'm not sure your name, but say this gentleman has $1 million he wants to give to the school district in your name. You can do that. But if he owns a business, ABC Manufacturer might want naming rights of the auditorium. Call it ABC Manufacturing Auditorium. If that's the case, that's bad money. So we need to be careful when we give out naming rights. Okay? If they just want to donate and that's it, that's great. But if they want their name on the building and it's not an individual, it's a company, then we need to be really careful about that. So talk to me about it. Talk to your attorney about it, and we'll figure it out. They do donations often, but it usually doesn't include naming rights. Now, there are ways we can do naming rights. We just have to do some unique maneuvering, which I can help you with. So bottom line, just talk to me first before you sign anything. I'll help you.
An individual private citizen, not a problem.
Not a problem.
A corporation or a company, that's the problem.
Correct. It's advertisement, right?
Okay.
You expect something in return, naming right. Now, ABC Manufacturing can give you money as long as they don't want your name on the stadium.
Right.
But if they want their name on the stadium or the locker room, there's workarounds. Again, don't be scared off. You find free money, that's great. So free money is always good money. But let's talk about it. Sure. Okay? Anything else by anyone? Well, thank you again for allowing me to come tonight. Hopefully this was helpful to all of you, and I'm happy to come back more often. If you want to do small groups and really dig into some of this stuff, I'm happy to do that. If you have numbers you want me to run, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to join community meetings. Once we get to that stage, if I speak, great. If I don't, I'm happy just to be there. So use me however you wish, and I wish you the best of luck with this. Thank you.
So much. All right. So at this point, we need a motion to go into executive session.
So moved.
Second.
Right, Mr. Rager,
Yes.
Mrs. Hartley,
Yes.
Mrs. Henners, Dr. LaFay, Mrs. Mast.
Yes.
Motion passed. It is 7:17.
Is
No.
this after?
There will not be any action after executive session. Not anticipated. We're gonna do picture first. We're gonna do a quick picture.